episode 37. Today's episode is going to be on climate change, but more on an emphasis of how fast should we be worried about it, or should we be making changes right away? Should we wait? Questions like that, and not so much on the numbers in particular. But today, before we get into all the details, I'm joined with my amazing co host, and I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Yes, hello, I'm Anavultus. You can find my work at my YouTube channel, Anavultus, which is also the channel on which this show is hosted every other show.
Yes, we alternate each week. And before we get into all the details, I want to announce this at the beginning and then we'll announce it again at the end. We will have this as the new showtime for Fridays because and this just works best for my schedule in particular. So you can go ahead and bookmark that on your schedule or calendar if you choose to do so.
Indeed.
Okay, so to as I mentioned before, uh, a lot of like climate change debates or climate change talks that I look at YouTube talk about a lot of numbers in particular about the environment. Some say that this is something that's you should be immediately concerned about. Others are more like, well, it exists, but whatever we do is not really going to change anything, and they talk about that. But what I haven't necessarily seen, and this takes a slightly more political angle than a environmental angle, is tackling the question of yes, climate change exists, but how fast should we do something about it? So that's kind of why I wanted to do it in this way for this episode, because I think that we would both agree that climate change does exist. Would you say you agree on that, or?
Yes, I
Yeah.
think the climate does change. It changes all the time, and it's been changing for quite some time. So, in that sense, I think that that is agreeable. Now, of course, there's different models on how exactly the climate changes and on what we should be expecting in the future. And of course, that's where the big disagreement comes in between with people on how this should be handled. Of course.
Right. That's what's kind of more of a high school debate more than anything else of anybody who has intellectual knowledge with it. Whether like, well, if you don't think that climate change exists, then blah blah blah. But taking the whole angle of if you say we don't do action now, then you're against climate change. I don't necessarily think that that is the case. But as you mentioned, uh, as you as you if I could speak, as you mentioned, if we know it exists, so how fast should we be worried, or what model should we take into consideration, and questions like that come into matter because you
Yeah,
have.
I
Oh yeah.
would I
Mm-hmm.
would propose a series of questions to examine the issue. I would say the first obvious question uh, is the climate changing? And then if it is changing, is this how is the climate changing? And once we know how the climate is changing, we have to ask ourselves, is this a problem? And then the question becomes, can something be done about this problem? And what can be done about the problem? And should something be done about the problem? And if something should be done about the problem, uh, what should be done specifically? And who should be the ones doing it? And I
Right.
think being able to answer all of those questions will uh, give you an outcome of uh, of how exactly it should be dealt with.
Right, because your last question is another reason what got me kind of thinking towards this angle, because you have for political news, you have the Green New Deal that got everybody's attention somewhat recently, before all the craziness, because it got voted down on again. But anyway, long story short, you have a action like that wants to tackle this effort now, and their questions before that would all be questions suggesting that uh, all be questions suggesting yes, if I remember the order of your questions, and saying that this is urgent. But not everybody comes to those same results. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think another element to this is besides the different climate models that people base their ideas on, it's I think one thing that we can agree upon is the idea that we shouldn't be uh, poisoning ourselves and our environment. I think that that's something that is agreeable to most people that you can that this is something that can be quantifiably shown to be harmful, to uh, poison fisheries or to poison the groundwater or to have excessively toxic chemicals in the air. Those things can be shown to be problems, and therefore, in the case that such things occur, those things should be addressed. But that's not really the same thing as climate change, because climate change isn't really looking at whether something is poisoning the environment as much as it is a question as to what is happening on a more broad scale. Are things warming up, cooling down, getting wetter, getting drier? Uh, is the are the air currents and the ocean currents flowing differently? Uh, those are matters related to climate change,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore, the idea of having a livable environment in the sense of avoiding pollution is actually a different question from climate change, I would argue.
Right, that's actually a very good point to bring up because a lot of climate change is, well, global. And that's why when you look up, climate change charts or climate change statistics, you're going to get sites like NASA and universities and things like that. And the models all show the Earth. And they show, the heating up or whatever model you're looking at. And it shows an entire thing. Now, could you get local with it? I mean, sure you could, but that's not really the core question of what climate change is, because climate change is looking at the whole thing. So that is a good point. And I would also argue on the somewhat similar note that that these local, well, I want to, okay, let me put it as a question. So you have the effort towards, and this may be looking a little bit too forward here, but we can always circle back, as Jim Paxi would say. But there's been an effort towards trying to change local things, from manufacturers trying to make electric cars to Apple not wanting to make as bad lithium batteries, because those are bad things when they end up not being used anymore. But anyway, so you have companies, you have local cities, local states trying to change efforts to fix the climate change. So to phrase my question, do you think that local changes are company changes, and the effort to try to fix climate change or to try to help climate change is really what they're doing, or do you think they're just helping other things and it should be under a different name?
Yeah. Well, in the case of, for example, avoiding fossil fuel usage, which is what I think a lot of this falls under, this has to do with a number of prominent climate models that have a particular focus on carbon dioxide as a major greenhouse gas, leading to climate change that is believed to have a negative impact. And that is, I would say, the most common model. It's not the only model. There's other models that argue differently, although those tend to be less favored by policymakers. in these recent days. But if it is your assumption that producing or releasing a large amount of carbon dioxide in the air would have a significantly negative impact on humanity and on the environment, then it makes sense under that line of reasoning to attempt to reduce the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And therefore, based on the climate model that is being used, it is a logical solution. Now, that being said, due to the way that this is all functioning in countries, we have to understand that this isn't simply based on individual people being persuaded that this is the best way to deal with climate change, and that therefore they themselves are the ones that are deciding on their own what should happen in the market. So it's not a free market affair in many cases, because what happens also is that the government in various countries will give subsidies to renewable energy companies, for example, or for various other purposes. And in the past, in the United States, for example, some companies have essentially taken advantage of this system in order to, since they have secured funding from the government to provide substandard service in their sectors. For example, substandard solar panels, or have cut costs in various ways in order to profiteer off of the climate concern. And therefore, in that sense, it has caused perhaps a significant amount of damage in some ways as well. And so whenever a question arises as to whether businesses should adjust to this, or whether the government specifically should cause businesses to adjust to this, we have to ask ourselves first, is the model that this is based on a true and accurate model? And as far as we are able to tell, there's no perfect model currently in existence on climate change. All models have inaccuracies, even the ones that people that are opposed to the anthropogenic climate change argument, even the models that those people use have inaccuracies. And therefore, there's still a lot we don't know about the climate. And therefore, it becomes an ethically questionable thing to move forward with policies that could potentially harm millions upon millions of people based on a faulty model. That's not to say that nothing should be done, but it is to call into the mind an idea of cautiousness, that we need to be careful, because there are people that are attempting to profiteer off of the climate change trend. And a lot of these people tend to offer substandard products, and this can be a huge risk. And then there's people that attempt to profiteer, politically speaking, who use it as a way to boost themselves politically without really caring about the consequences. And they generate a hysteria around this idea in order to galvanize their voting base. And this happens as well. And I think another example, and I think that this is an interesting one, is the idea of carbon credits, wherein an international body would establish carbon credits that countries would have to purchase in order to release emissions. Now, of course, there's the potential of early investors getting into the business while it's cheap, and therefore taking advantage of other countries that are behind the curve on this issue. And also, another element to this is that developing countries tend to be more reliant on the less efficient fuel sources, or the fuel sources that release more greenhouse gases. And because of this, developing countries are at a disadvantage in a situation where carbon neutrality becomes the new preferred situation, which can lead to a dependence upon other countries for their energy that might not necessarily have happened under current conditions. So, therefore, what I'm saying is there's a lot of room for exploitation on this, and therefore, it is extremely important to be very careful in how to proceed on policies based on the climate change, policies based on something that is still not fully understood.
Right, and to go along the lines of what you were just saying there, there's also a general debate between people that let's put it this way, people that think that climate change is a thing, but are cautious of how much money or how much resources, all of those should be put into it. And then later, they go on to say something similar to this. So the whole idea is, well, if climate change is a thing and if we should put resources into it, what resources should we put in? And you have people saying, well, oh, nuclear energy is more efficient, even though Chernobyl has happened. We know how to prevent it. It is somewhat riskier, but it's safe. Blah blah blah. No, you can have hydro here, wind here. You have all this, and everybody says which one's their favorite. But there's also the other side that says before we build anything more from alternative energy, solar, wind, whatever, we need to be able to have a way to store it, because there is a problem with the storage of this energy, because it pretty much has to be used right away. There is some caveats to it. I'm not a energy expert by any means, but there's a big focus on resources like wind and resources like how to store it. How
Yep.
if we come up with something to store this, we could uh, help climate change in that effort. And so basically, which angle should be taken?
Yeah, and for people who don't know exactly what you mean by storage, I'll explain here. With power sources that are based on fuels, you can stop burning the fuel, and you still have the fuel to burn. Meanwhile, with power sources like wind and solar, you really have to take the power as it comes, and it's a bit difficult to store large amounts of power, at least in the amounts that would be useful on a large scale, in the case of wind and solar. So with solar, you have to hope for a sunny day and a good alignment of the solar panels with the sun. And with wind, you have to hope that it's a windy day. And of course, certain areas are better suited to solar and wind than other areas. And of course, a, another element of this is that wind and solar power require a large amount of room in order to in order to gain power. So it's not as restricted as a power plant. You need vast amounts of space in order to generate large amounts of wind and solar power, which can also lead to environmental destruction. Perhaps not in the same sense that smog and fumes would be from burning fossil fuels, but it is a different type of environmental destruction where you have to utilize large amounts of land for power generation. So, going back onto what you're saying, yes, I do agree that the storage issue is a major issue that needs addressing. And of course, if that storage issue is resolved, we could perhaps uh, look into perhaps exploiting lightning for energy. But that's a long off dream, you could say. Um, but what was your question in particular?
So I guess to phrase my question uh, somewhat better is, what do you think? So let's agree that climate change is a concern, and we should come up with some strategy to help it. We're not worried about money yet. We're just saying, what strategy would you go with originally? Would you go with a strategy of producing more wind turbines, more solar power, or would you go with a strategy of trying to research something for storage?
Um, the thing about strategies that focus on research is that you don't have a guarantee of success.
Yes.
And this is why research is so expensive. It's because a lot of time and money goes into it, and you don't really have a guarantee that something will come out at the end. So, in that sense, I would not, while I would not prevent research, I certainly would want research. I also would not want to base my strategy on something that I have no guarantee that I'll be able to get. And therefore, basing strategies on technology that we don't have the means to develop currently, but we think we will have the means to develop in the future, in my view, is not the wisest plan. And therefore, I would say that I would prefer nuclear power. Uh, and I think that it would probably be the best alternative to fossil fuels in because unlike fossil fuels, you don't end up producing large amounts of fumes, and also unlike the other renewable sources, you don't end up using as much land. Now, that being said, people still say, well, what about the waste? There's a number of different strategies for getting rid of nuclear waste. The one way is to simply bury it underground. And before people say that that's dangerous and polluting, we also have to understand that our radioactive elements that are used for nuclear power also are already in the ground. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not that different from simply uh, burying something when you had already taken it out of the ground in the first place. So,
But what about Chernobyl?
well, the thing is, it's been decades since then, and both our technology for dealing with nuclear problems and safety procedures have advanced significantly. And it could be even said that in some cases, regulations on nuclear power have even gone excessively beyond what is necessary for safety. And it could even be argued that there might be a need to deregulate some of those areas. But nevertheless, as long as we can hold the people accountable for what they're doing and we know that they have safety procedures, and we're not trying to do fancy experiments, because that's what happened at Chernobyl. They were doing an experiment.
Very badly done.
It wasn't, yeah, what they were doing wasn't part of a regular power plant process. It was a special experiment. Knowing all of these things, I think nuclear power is perhaps one of the safest power generation methods available.
Yes. And just real quick, for anybody that hasn't seen the HBO series Chernobyl, I highly recommend watching that. It was really well done. And it's not the most. Well, it is factual, but there's other like documentaries if you want like the hard facts of what exactly happened. But it's a good show. But
Yeah, it's a bit dramatized, you could say.
right, right. But as far as nuclear energy, I've kind of always been a fan of nuclear energy myself. I remember in high school we had to pick one and write about it, and that's the one I picked because
Yeah.
it just makes the most sense to me. The most yeah, it just makes the most sense.
Yeah, and of course, China. In China now, there's experiments moving forward with the idea of thorium reactors, and I know that there's a lot of hype around thorium reactors, but this is something where the technology now does exist, and it is something that is being explored. So, based on the success, if there's success in that in China, that may be something that people might want to look into because it would perhaps an improvement to other types of nuclear power, depending on how it operates, of course.
Hmm.
And of course, that remains to be seen. But the technology for that is something that is currently in development. So it's not something that we're hoping long far off. We do have a proof of concept. So
Right.
yeah,
So to answer another question that I think some people might be having when we take this approach, do you think that climate control, I guess you could put it in this way, should be handled by the government by passing laws uh, on restrictions, or do you think it should be handled by industries, such as, car manufacturers producing more electronic cars, or not electronic, but electric cars, even though there's caveats with those. But anyway, do you think it
yeah.
should be up to industries or the government as a whole?
Well, yeah. This is a complex question
Yeah.
because asking ourselves the question of who should be responsible for dealing with potential problems in the climate is a very heavy question because whoever gets whoever receives this responsibility has a significant amount of power and also a significant potential for abuse of such power. I would personally prefer a community based approach wherein uh, wherein people in their communities can decide what types of regulations they want on such issues, but also that if it comes to a quantifiable harm, that there can be litigation in between different communities and perhaps on a larger scale as well when it is quantifiable. Because currently, it's not very quantifiable. It's hard to tell exactly um, what exactly is causing what and how everything moves. Because although we do have some understanding of the climate, we still have a lot of things missing from the puzzle. You could say it's still not a complete understanding, and therefore this leads to the existence of differing models supported by real scientists, I will add, that take radically different proposals on how the climate is changing and what exactly is causing the change. And so there's some models that take an approach that says that it's uh, mostly, if not all, naturalistic, something that goes to a more long term natural process. And then there's other models that say that humans are actually very important in climate change. And then there's models in between that exist as well. Now, currently, most governments have decided to promote the more anthropogenic side of things, uh, and arguably to a point where discussions are being shut down in some cases for alternative positions on this. and I don't think that this is a something that is healthy for a scientific discourse. Even if you strongly disagree with such positions, and even if you believe that all the evidence is on your side, um, I don't think that taking such a strong approach is a way that actually resolves the problem. Because if you do end up being wrong, the risk of being wrong on this can lead to huge amounts of damage economically, politically, socially, and therefore it is something that must always be a careful approach, and also there must be constant reinspection of the models to ensure that they align with what we are seeing and with new evidence that might arise.
100%. Because it is important that scientists are the ones that are running these models. It's not like you have somebody in his basement putting in trying to come up with a model. I'm sure those exist, but those aren't the ones that are being showed out in media and whatnot. And you do have scientists on both sides of this debate, and that's why it's still a debate. But a couple things came to mind when you were talking about there, but I think I'll ask this question first, and we can get into the other parts later because I think it'll make more sense. So, with what your idea is, going to community, you would say that you don't think this is a immediate issue, or do you think that going to the community is a way to fix it immediately, or do you think it can be fixed immediately? There's a lot of questions there, but
Well, I agree partially with Eleanor Ostrom's, a Nobel Prize winning economist's idea that limited natural resources can be managed very effectively in communities, and that this is a good model for the management of limited resources and environmental integrity. Now, in that sense, I would argue that in light of the failure of some more centralized approaches to other issues related to ecology and economics, I would argue that taking a fully centralized approach can lead to a number of problems, because errors that occur in a solution model for climate change on a more centralized approach tend to be magnified because they become ubiquitous in the entire system. And therefore, in my view, it would be better to have smaller consensus based approaches in order to deal with ecological issues, in order to prevent the magnification of errors, and also to allow people uh, to have a freedom of conscience that I think is very important when dealing with such issues.
okay, right. I mean, I generally agree with that. I was just wondering about your opinion on that question. I do want to mention that I have read, or not read, I listened to a guest on the Tom Woods show, and I'll put him in the description of the video as well. Uh, when I remember to. But anyway, his whole argument was that instead of reducing fossil fuels, we should rather uh, we should rather keep fossil fuels going and take a different approach. So his argument was that government, and he took the idea that government regulations like Paris Accords and organizations similar to it actually end up hurting more than they help, because the countries that don't have a boatload of money, supposedly as the United States does, it can really suffer their economy if they try to do some of the things that the Paris Accord suggest. And in his approach was taking the effect of we should rather try to do different things and not worry about the fossil fuel angle. So there is that argument out there. Uh, I don't think it exists very much within this climate change debate, but there is some pro
Yeah.
fossil fuel people.
And of course that's coming from the Tom Woods show, so it's a
Right.
more libertarian perspective, typically speaking. Um, but I say that a, a decentralized approach, in my view, would be an approach that's better for the conscience of people, and also an approach that can lead to a competition in solutions that can perhaps lead to the emergence of better solutions. And in that sense, I think that that would be an approach that is more beneficial. And of course, once we actually have stronger evidence that we can point to that says that taking particular actions have a quantifiable harm, then we can begin taking legal action. But until that point, and I'm certain we are not at that point in our understanding of climate science, I don't think that we can take such an authoritarian approach on this issue.
So, okay, I can I definitely understand that. It's a very analytical approach to it. I would say very yeah, very analytical approach. But let's hypothetically say, and I don't think this hypothetical would ever be that case, but that's why it's a hypothetical. Let's hypothetically say that the model never ends up working out exactly right, but there's some events in the climate or whatever, and it ends up making the world worse. So scientists look back and say, well, if we did these things, it could have made it better, but we didn't because we were trying to focus on the model. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is, if we take your idea of until the model works, we should take a more localized approach. Which do you think that the model would ever just get better? I'm not sure. I could probably
Well,
phrase the question better than that, but
different communities would probably use different models. There'd probably be groups of them that have a consensus on a particular model. Um, but the question would be, would that be able? I think the question that people favoring a particular model would say is, well, that's not actually going to help because people are going to be pushing in different directions. And and then that becomes a question of ethics, of are you going to force everyone to go on a single model, and even if we assume that after the fact we see that the model was true, I don't think that that is a just approach. And if that leads to a large amount of environmental damage that could have been prevented by following, let's say, the most popular model, let's say that the most popular model, if following it after the fact would have shown to be the most advantageous side, but by me advocating for decentralized a decentralized approach and allowing people to have freedom of conscience, that has thwarted the the success of people that were trying to fix the climate based on that model, and then that has led to large amounts of harm. I don't think that that's really an ethical problem, and that is because I'm working based on information that is available to me, and I'm also certain that taking an approach that goes well to the conscience of people is a good approach, and that even if that were to accidentally lead to the destruction of the environment, I don't think that that is something that is something on which we can hold people like me to be culpable for. Because on the same token, we could say, well, what if the less popular model is true? And then the people that are attempting to conform all of policy to the most popular model are actually doing massive amounts of harm, uh, and are perhaps ruining the environment. And so, if we take this approach, I I think that the most ethical approach is to not commit 100% to a single model, and instead allow us to keep our options open and to have a freedom of conscience, even if that were to lead to irreparable harm to the environment. I think that it is the most ethical approach.
Right. Uh, I'm not even sure if this could be doable because I don't know about all the different model types, but I'm assuming, as you mentioned before, some models take into account human, other human things, and other models simply just look at, temperature or carbon or whatever, those models that focus on particular things. So I'm not really sure if this would be possible to do, but let's say you could combine models together and come up with a hybrid that has some commonalities between it. Again, I'm not really sure if this could be done. Would that be the model you think would be accepted in this case? If communities would, try to, so hypothetically, let's say in all the communities decide, you know what, I think although we're free in our choice, we should probably, at least in this region, come up with one strategy so we could help each other out. Let's make a model. Do you think that this could be done?
If they agree to do it, I think that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Um, yeah.
As I,
If we all were agreed on the issue, I think that would be fine. But the fact is that we're not agreed, and that's why this is a conversation that people are having. Uh, and of course, in this show, we're not actually talking about the models themselves, but more on the question of uh, when does this become a problem, and what should be done about it if it is a problem.
mm-hmm.
So, but I think that if people agree on this issue, then that's fine. If they all want to proceed with the same policy, I don't have a problem with that. What I do have a problem with is the idea that everyone should proceed on a policy that has such a huge impact without necessitating such a type of agreement. Not because I'm a hyper populist in any sense, because I'm not a populist, but because I think that liberty of conscience for me is very important. But in the case of looking at the question of what if we all agreed, I'm not a pragmatist, okay? So I don't think that a consensus is something that should be used as something that we can define the truth upon, because that's what pragmatism is as a philosophy. It is that we have a consensus, and we're going to use this consensus and treat it as if it is the foundation of our truth. And this developed in the US in the 1800s. And it seems to be relatively popular among a lot of people that are very focused on sort of consensus based science solutions. So these people say there's a majority opinion among scientists, and therefore that's what we should base our policies upon. And I don't think that that is, in my view, a very realistic approach. I don't think that it is an ethical approach. because I think it can lead to a lot of problems. Now, that being said, if we had a full consensus, then obviously I wouldn't be the one disagreeing with what would be happening. And I also don't think that it would be, I still don't think that it would be a problem under that uh, sense if something ended up going wrong with the model. Because if we all agreed to take this model and we all agreed to implement it, and something still went wrong and we destroyed our environment, uh, we would still all agree that it would be based on what the best information that we had available for ourselves at the time. And therefore, I don't think that that would be a problem. What I do think is a problem is when we are forcing people to go against their conscience, and we are preemptively accusing people of destroying the environment before we even have a common ground with that person on environmental issues, on the climate. And I think that this is a trend that is happening not only in policy circles, but in some grassroots movements. Uh, for example, in the UK, there's something called Extinction Rebellion, where there's people that are uh, very, very zealous about climate change. And for some people, not just in the UK, but in the US, climate change is considered the big issue, the major issue of what is going to determine the future of society, what is going to determine whether or not humanity survives. And this hyper politicized and also hyper centralization type movement can be damaging to the discourse, because anybody that questions such a position immediately gets labeled as someone who is leading to the end of humanity or the destruction of the planet. And even if we assume that the model is accurate, even though, even under the models that they use, as far as I'm aware, that wouldn't happen, to be honest. Uh, it, because in my view, it's a bit more of a fear mongering type idea there. But even if we were to assume that that would be something that would actually happen under their model, I don't think that that justifies the strong, vehement opposition that they have to people that question their perspective on this.
Right. You have the whole movement of climate people and lawmakers, and some people could be critical of someone like AOC who's trying to pass the Green New Deal for a political motive, but she definitely has a crowd of people that think that this is the best idea, hands down. In other words, there's a big group, a big vocal group, I should say, of people that think that instant policy needs to happen now. Like we're past due on trying to help climate change. So, and those people would go as far as to probably say, ignore the models. We just need to do something right now, or point to one model.
I think that such an approach is destructive, not only to questions concerning the climate, but also policy making in general. This idea of we have to do something right away. If we don't do anything, it's the end, leads to a very careless approach that I think will probably do more harm than good.
Right. Uh, Very short-sighted in a lot of ways. Um, yeah. Anything, especially policy-wise, I think needs to be. There's a reason why bills are written the way they are and why they take so long. There's a reason for that, because there's a process of trying to get all into information, trying to get it written in a way that it can't be taken advantage of. There's a whole structure of how law and how bills work. and there's difference between the two, yes, but I'm just saying there's a whole structure in how it's written. Uh, and If you look at the Green New Deal in particular, it's not really written in the way you would usually think of it. It's almost written, and I don't want to say this in. Okay, I'll say it. It's written in a way for a normal person to understand. Like, I read it and I'm like, okay, I get what they're saying. And there's advantages to that, but it's too simple and it's too problemsome. It's written to try to encourage this movement, in my opinion.
Yeah. So you think it's more of a publicity stunt rather than an actual policy?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I would say that if, let's say, such a such a thing were to be passed as a policy, I do think that while while excessively abstract terms should be avoided in writing policies, I do think that specificity in language is important in policy making, because if language is too vague or too general, it leads to a situation where laws can be interpreted in unintended ways, which can cause a lot of problems. And therefore, I do think that a degree of legalese is important when making laws, in order to have the exact specificity that is needed to ensure that a law actually regulates what it is supposed to regulate. Now, in the case of a Green New Deal, uh, there have been a lot of criticisms about the Green New Deal, and I think that whatever we do in relation to climate change, we should avoid doing something that would potentially destroy our civilization or destroy our country, uh, because from a realist standpoint, doing something that is highly extreme without a care can indeed cause a lot of damage, and therefore lead to a strategic disadvantage that can lead to other countries gaining advantages and dominating the not just their neighbors, but perhaps the country that put forward the bad legislation. So, in that sense, there's not only a an economic factor to this, of looking at economic benefits and damages, and also a political power play happening, but also we have to be concerned about the international implications and the implications for a country, because I'm certain that there are some people that would be willing to say that we should abandon civilization to save the environment. But I think that such a perspective, and I'm not accusing the Green New Deal crowd or mainstream people of having such a perspective, but there are people that hold such a perspective. I think that such a perspective certainly does not benefit the strategic interests of any country, and therefore it is something that should be avoided as much as possible.
Right. Like there's also many other environmental concerns than just climate change. Like for instance, there's I think this is also a little bit overblown too, but there is a big thing going on now of the oceans and overfishing and over other things, and that they think that it could eventually lead to the unknown ocean life that we don't even know exists to no longer be there. So we're killing the oceans very fast. And some people say that's part of this whole movement of climate change. But once again, there's so many different shades to environment, and yeah, I just felt like that also needed to be mentioned. It's not like there's just this one thing going around within
Yeah,
this movement.
yeah, yeah, and I would argue that overfishing and overhunting are, in my view, issues that are separate to climate change, because they deal with the usage of specific resources that can be held as a common resource by multiple groups that might be active in a fishery or a particular uh, ecological region. So, similar to how you could say that oil reserves, underground oil reserves that cross borders, can become a source of conflict because if one side starts taking out the oil, it can also deplete the oil on the other side of a border. So, and a similar thing is true about overfishing because different countries have different regulations on fishing, and therefore some countries can have advantages in fisheries.
Right. Mm-mm. It's just another kind of interesting thing going on. But I had a question, but it just left my brain. I'll do this. So we've talked about numerous things from the most recently Green New Deal and the whole approach. And this question is more of hypothetical again. And I don't know if it's even necessarily possible to answer, but I'll go ahead and just ask. So let's say you're in charge of this community, right? And how much time would you give to to start this approach? So in other words, would you say, well, let's wait for a model to where we think is accurate and then we can start working, or would you go, okay,
Well,
let's start
I'm not saying
small,
that
or yeah,
I'm not saying that we have to wait for a perfect model.
okay,
Let me make that very clear. I'm saying that we have to be careful when we use a model so that we don't accidentally uh, damage ourselves in a way that is not commensurate with what the model is asking of us risk wise. For example, if we are only 50% certain that X thing will happen, then we shouldn't put 100% of our bets into that 50% chance because that would leave us in a huge amount of trouble if we ended up on the other side of the 50% where X does not happen. And therefore, we need to weigh the risks and also weigh the integrity of models. And this isn't a perfect process. This isn't a process that has only one way of doing, and that's why there's obviously going to be different solutions to this. But if I took a model on climate change and was reasonably certain that something in my community would cause a negative impact on the climate, I would argue that I would take measures against it immediately.
okay,
And I wouldn't say perhaps the most stringent measures imaginable, because if I'm not certain on the issue, I certainly wouldn't use the most stringent measures imaginable. I would use perhaps softer measures, uh, perhaps enter into a dialogue to see what could be done in order to resolve a problem without causing excessive harm to the community, to the economy, etc. Because I don't want to destroy a community for the simple purpose of fixing the climate if I'm not even 100% certain that's going to work. So it is something where a careful approach is necessary, and it is going to depend on which models you take seriously and which solutions you think will work, and how much weight you put on these models, and how much cooperation you have with other people. So it is necessarily, in my view, a case by case issue where people are going to come up with different solutions, because right now we're not going into the models themselves. We're just talking about what to do about it. And if I believed that there was a serious issue, I would certainly do something right away, even if it is not the the biggest thing. And that's why I don't think people can be faulted for wanting immediate changes. What I do think people can be faulted for is a recklessness of change and a disregard for the conscience and the opinions of other people, and including the scientists that have other approaches to the problem and its solutions.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. I think I'm slightly misunderstood you on that one, but I do definitely see what you're saying. So, to conclude with this topic, actually, quickly, I'll mention if you do want us to cover models, because maybe this is something that interests you, you can definitely let us know in the comment section, and we could do an episode. If not, we may choose to do something else. But just letting you know, we do read everyone's comments.
Yeah, although I would say that if we were to do that, I certainly would want to have a guest who is perhaps better versed in the topic.
Right, and we can set it for a future episode once we know we can get a guest. So to conclude with this topic, I guess I'll give my thoughts first. So obviously, I do think that climate change does exist. I don't necessarily think that we need to be doing things right now to necessarily fix it, but at the same time, if there is a solution, I don't necessarily think that you shouldn't seek that solution. And obviously, we would have to get into details of what that means, but basically, my whole thing is I don't necessarily think that government should be super involved right now with trying to come up with a national standards of fixing climate change till we know of better ways to do so. And I take more the storage angle of all of this. Even though it is something that may not end up resulting in success, I still think that it's the best approach to go, not a all-in approach, but the best approach to seek towards.
Yes. And my position, as I've already stated, is that uh, whatever we do, we need to avoid being reckless, and we need to be considerate of the fact that there is not a consensus, and that we have to respect the conscience of other people so that we don't end up doing something that is unethical in our attempt to save the environment.
Right, and real quick, as I mentioned at the start, Fridays at 10 Central Time or 11 Eastern Time will be our new show time. And next episode will be on Anavultus channel as we do alternate each week. And I'll leave any last word or any shout out you want to give or anything coming up on your end.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for watching, and our beautiful audience, of course. Uh, I will be hosting next week, and you can also read my book, Actionable Justice. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and